Shana Tova. Shana Tova. Good Yantiv. There was a story last winter, of an 11-year-old boy who left the Ukraine, walked out of his town by himself in the midst of Russian bombs. He lived near the nuclear plant that was in the middle of all the hostilities back then, just as it is now. And he traveled all alone, day and night, mostly by train, through hills and valleys. And he had nothing but a plastic bag and on his hand was written a number of someone to call when he reached the other side. And his mother sent him because she had to take care of her elderly mother, and she was a widow, and she had to take care of her other children. And so he left alone. But on the way, he was helped by soldiers, by all kinds of people wherever he went. And all in all, he traveled 700 miles, all the way to Slovakia. And seeing the look in the boy's picture, it's amazing. He looked like a young boy from any city that I've lived in, young and innocent, and he had a nondescript bomber jacket up and a beanie, a sweet face, not that different than any of the children that I see walking across the street in River Forest on a winter day. Could have been one of them. And all he had was that plastic bag and a number on his hand. But on his face, there was this deep resolve. When one read this story, all those who came in contact with him were deeply impressed. And he said that he conquered all with his smile, with his deep resolve, his fearlessness, his determination. So he still had that number on his hand when he arrived in Slovakia, and he called his relatives. He ended up meeting the Prime Minister of Slovakia. And you hear such stories and it strengthens one. And you think we have it all right. Our children and our grandchildren and our nephews and our nieces do not have to deal with such circumstances. But seeing that boy, I couldn't help but think of my children. And what would they do if they were put in such a situation? How would they respond? And how would we respond? And us too, in our own way, we have also been dealing with hardship and adversity in a different way, in a complex way, trying to find our way in this environment of division and polarization on every single issue of importance to people in this nation on what is life, what are our most cherished values, how do we respond to the climate, what freedom is, and what happens when some people's freedom leads others to be less safe. And the pandemic, and navigating its presence, and also the feeling of responsibility as Americans of helping Ukraine in the midst of a situation that could end up much worse for them, for us, and for the whole world. And yet there in Ukraine, amidst all of the moral complexity of all of our other battles, it feels like at least the West, us, are fighting evil. And it's not often we can completely call it that way, that we are fighting evil. And part of Rosh Hashanah, this day which is a day of judgment for us as individuals, is also thinking about our world and strengthening our own resolve to do good and to renew ourselves to fight against evil. And one of the reasons we sound the shofar is to dispel the presence of evil, to renew our goodness as well, our resolve, our commitment to goodness. And we have to seek out the goodness. We have to renew the goodness every year. We have to renew it in our hearts. We have to renew it in our lives and have faith in it, and then engrave it for the year ahead. We can say that amidst it all was also a year when goodness was renewed in many small but real ways. And that is part of our role as Jews in the world, that we've played in almost every generation. In almost every generation we've done this. We've tried to renew goodness in our hearts amidst what was happening in the world around us, and to battle evil and negativity and despair in the world around us. And that is in fact embedded in our very name, Israel, the name that was first bestowed on Jacob after he wrestled all night with the angel. One of the defining stories of our people at the bottom of that fourth copper window. What happened as we read in the Torah, Jacob encountered the angel. It was 21 years after he had to flee his home because of stealing the blessing from his brother Esau. And Jacob had fled, and he was all alone. And then he returned home with his wives, his children, his flock, his possessions. And on the way home, he heard that Esau, his long-lost brother, was coming his way with 400 armed men. And he panicked. And so he took his camp, he divided it in two sides, hoping at least one of the two parts of his camp would survive an attack by his own brother and the men that came with him. And finally, as night came, he'd sent the camps away, and he was all alone, levad. And that was when the angel came and started to attack and to wrestle with him. And he wrestled until the day broke, and the angel was defeated. And that was when he was given the name Israel. So Jacob made an offering, and he went out to see Esau. But Esau, seeing Jacob, now Israel, was overcome by sadness, and instead he embraced his brother. And so our tradition, through the words of Rashi, our medieval rabbi who took 1,000 years of Jewish thinking, of the oral Torah, and put it into one commentary on the Torah, he explains that Jacob that night was fighting the guardian angel of Esau. We each have a guardian, and Esau's guardian, as he was evil. And so Jacob was wrestling with an evil force. And Esau, through our prophets and our later rabbis, comes to be symbolic of evil. He sold his divine inheritance from Abraham and Isaac for naught, a bowl of soup. He scorned the treasures of our people. And he was not just a man, he symbolized the forces of violence, of moral degradation, of negativity, of hate, of spreading despair, of evil. He let all of those into the world. To the rabbis, Esau was Rome, a military force that had no pity and with no compassion, was completely ruthless, hedonistic, totally physical in every approach, believing the might was right. And the rabbis, they saw themselves as the force that was a counterweight against that view of belief. So according to Rashi, what Jacob was wrestling with was that evil force of Jacob's guardian. And that means that the name Israel, which is the spiritual name of Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes, of all of our people through 3.5 millennia, he who wrestles with God, was the name of the man who prevailed against Esau's evil guardian being, wrestled against, but ultimately prevailed. And Rashi understood that in this moment of Jacob's spiritual transformation, a part of who we are as a people was also born, part of our place. We can see some of that Rashi's comment come alive in the top of that fourth window up there, where Jacob is facing what looks like a monster. And in our view, like other religions, God does have dominion over all. It's not like there's a power of evil that can match God. We do not believe in that. We believe in echad, in unity. Everything comes from God. Even the darkness comes ultimately from the divine. But nonetheless, in our world, Jews must face and fight evil. And in our generations who have come after the horrors of the Shoah, it's not hard to see that truth. As has been obvious to us, where we've seen anti-Semitism rise, often there's a deep issue and problem at work there. And how strange it is that in this fight in Ukraine, the president of Ukraine is Jewish. And yet, as the smallest of people, dispersed, unique, and separate, we have so often been the object of hate, of small-mindedness, of evil. In Egypt, where Pharaoh saw that the Jews had come down with Joseph were becoming too numerous and he worried they would become a fifth column, he made a decree to turn them into slaves. When, as the Midrash recounts, he heard that a savior would be born to them, he ordered the death of all the male babies. And yet, it didn't work. The midwives saved the babies, and Moses himself was saved in the basket. And later, Jews who were living as minorities and through oppression and hardship, they saw Pharaoh as a human being, just like Esau, embodying evil and all that had overtaken him. They imagined Pharaoh's palace and called it the palace of the 49 gates of impurity. And in Persia, Haman, who saw that there was one Jew, Mordecai, who refused to bow down to him, and grew so furious and so full of vengeance that he decided to kill all the Jews. And that evil state of mind opens the door to more negativity and spreads. And our role has been to be witnesses to it, to be present where a few human beings are threatening to take all of us to their depth of their darkness, and to call them out on the front lines of so many of the worst instincts of human beings. What is anti-Semitism? Yossi Klein Halevi, a speaker who was here, an author, a few years ago at the synagogue, he wants to find anti-Semitism as making the Jew symbolic of what is most loathsome in any civilization. The worst race polluters to the racists, God killers by medieval Christians, the most uninhibited capitalists by the communists, and yet also the world domineering communists to the capitalists, colonialists in our world of. And so we wrestle with the hate, and we wrestle with the evil, and often to our own loss and suffering. And yet, we have always prevailed. Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people lives. Am Yisrael Chai. And this is part of our role in the world. And it is challenging, and it is also blessed in its own way. And so, to stand for the power of goodness, to renew our commitment to goodness every year is part of what we do for ourselves and for the whole world. And in the Shema prayer, our central affirmation of faith, the Jews have said in so many circumstances, in every Torah scroll in the world, the last letter of the Hebrew word Shema, the letter Ayin, is written in purposefully in larger letters, twice as big as all the other letters. And so too the last letter of the word Echad, the Dalet, is written in those large letters. So together, if you look at the essential core statement of our faith, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. In an actual Torah scroll, there are two letters that come up and they spell Ed, witness. And part of our role is to be witnesses to God through history, to human behavior, to human morality, to be the canary in the coal mine when there's that loss of norms, when there's that denigration of morality, when human behavior leads to corruption and hate and evil and lies, as we're seeing with the growth of anti-Semitism in our country over the past few years. So last year there was that long Shabbat. We heard that there was that hostage crisis in Texas. It was at a small Reform synagogue. And we did not know how it would end up. Right? This year we're celebrating 50 years since the Munich massacre at the Olympics, and we know how those situations can end. But the rabbi there was a hero. First, he let the terrorist in because he thought he was a person in need and offered him tea. Maybe that softened him up from doing the worst. And when the moment came, he threw a chair at the terrorist so that his congregants could run. Yasher koach. And this way, this behavior, facing debased behavior, facing evil intention, was said in our scriptures millennia ago, and through our most powerful voices, in all of the different ways we face it. 3,500 years ago, our Torah says, when you encounter your fellow's ox stranded by the side of the road, even your enemy's ox, you care for it. And you care for the stranger, because we all know what it's like to be a stranger, the most repeated commandment in the Torah. And more importantly, to ourselves live by that moral and ethical conduct ourselves in everything we do, to embody it. And the prophets thundered, this is what would happen if you yourselves do not live by that conduct, caring for the needy, refusing to sell the poor for a pair of sandals, and where that could lead us to become as the most corrupt of nations. And so strict morality and being forces for good was how we were to embody that role through the ages, what God demanded of us, as we see on Yom Kippur, more than fasting, more than sacrifices. And if we lost that sense of who we are, we would lose all of it, our treasured place, our protection. And all of those Jewish thinkers and philosophers and humanitarians and servants of humanity, all those activists who have raised their voices through the ages against the evils of injustice with their pen, with their actions, with their lives. And who so often had to give those very lives to close the doors to those worst instincts of humanity and to the evil channel that they gave power to. And this calling is embedded in our deepest moment of communion with our God. The Mount Sinai, when God said, will you be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests? And the Jewish people, we said yes. And what is a priest? A priest in our tradition is one who seeks out impurity and purifies it. Right? The Kohen, as we read about through the books, the book of Leviticus especially, the middle book of the Torah, as importantly as making the sacrifices, he would pronounce the impure pure and the pure impure. He would examine, as we read the most about, the case of the leper of biblical times, who we were taught it was stricken because of a moral failing. And according to tradition, the priest would then decide to leave the camp or not to leave the camp. And that was a central part of their return. And they too had to live a special, scrupulous lives, enhance moral considerations, how to walk in the world, what they did, how they behaved in their family lives, whom they married, the high priest even more than the others. They had to embody that moral purity expected of them. And they were to be agents of witnessing and stating what was pure and what was impure, calling it out, standing up for it. We can imagine it did not always make them popular to be that person. HaKohen mitaher, the priest purifies. And to purify, the priest had to embody the purity. And so we see it through our history. We have looked out to see what was impure in societal behavior and have not been afraid to call it impure, to raise our voice. And we purify in all kinds of ways. To remove the impurity, we wrestle, Israel, to bring it to wholeness. In our own lives, we have our whole day, Yom Kippur, to do that work in our own selves. A whole day that's like a mikvah, says the Mishnah and Rabbi Akiva, cleansing bath to renew ourselves in this way. The priest purifies, as does the kingdom of priests. And through the millennia, we've been called to embody and experience some of the deepest moral questions that humanity have faced. And there is a story of the What a humbling, powerful story it is of the inmates of the concentration camps that were liberated. And they were offered to take revenge on the Nazi guards by the Russian liberators. And the soldiers said, "Here are weapons, there are your guards, your oppressors. We will look the other way for 24 hours. But as one of the stories said, they refused to. And they said to the guards, "They have taken everything from us. They've taken our families, they've taken our homes, our lives, and all we have left is our humanity. And if we do this, we will lose that too." In that moment, they modeled moral clarity, wisdom, profound wisdom that we are still living in its shadow 70 years later. In their way, in that moment, for all kinds of ways that it happened in other places as well, they were moral kohanim. And there are moments where we also struggle with our role as priests, moral priests. And as a people, we failed also tremendously at embodying that morality, as we've seen with all the people in the news, Jews who are there for the wrong reason over the past decades. But we wrestle. And every year we try and rededicate ourselves to be vessels for the good, for the new, and for the beautiful, for life, for the power of embodying that moral purity, from being witnesses to evil, and just to see the good and to fight for the new and for the beautiful. Because the beautiful has also been part of our calling against evil. And is there any better way to chase away the darkness of humanity's lower emotions than to bring in art and life and music and all those parts of our society that reflects what's most exquisitely beautiful about us as human beings, what's most divine about humanity, and to lift us up, to perceive the glimpses of eternity, and to reflect the light of the divine unto others, to chase away the darkness that on their face, by our laughter, by our families, and to lift the thoughts and hearts of men and women, and to be vessels for all the good stories of humanity, to be actors in them and to be vessels for them, to share them, from America to Ukraine, all those times that people have also helped another human being, have been of assistance to another human being, driving away evil, and to remind us of the bravery of being resolute, of the simplicity of goodness, when a person in need helps a boy traveling on the train 700 miles. And giving those our thoughts, and giving those our focus and energy. And each one of us can do that in so many small ways in our lives, to being that goodness and that light. And in Judaism, we do not even talk about death. We're about life. We're focused on what is beautiful and life-giving. Yid Gadal v'Yid Kadash, as we declare in the Mourner's Kaddish, may the divine name be magnified and sanctified. Because we seek to be open to life and to the beauty of our world, and to make it accessible and real, and to live in that world of culture and ideas and music and art and history and religion. And every one of us can play a part. So, Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot teaches, in the name of Hillel, the first of rabbis, greatest of rabbis, in a world where there is no man, strive to be a man. Or as I would change it perhaps, in a world where there is no humanity, strive to be that humanity. And that even in a world where evil ways predominate, we're still commanded to find that strength. We're still commanded to find our humanity and our goodness. And that traditional expression in Judaism, to be a mensch, means to be truly human, to be strong in what we believe. And to explain what this quotation from Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, means, one of our great commentaries on the Mishnah, the Yom Tov, says, make it a habit in your life to be a real human being, to make those moral decisions in your day-to-day life. And then when the moment arrives and you're challenged to act, you know you'll do it because it will be a habit. create the habit of moral uprightness. Many years ago, I worked as a rabbinical student for an elderly rabbi who was 89 years old, an Orthodox rabbi who was ordained in pre-war Berlin, studied at the Rosh seminary, and he had gotten into business as well as being a rabbi. He was 89 and his memory had been going for a few years. And every time we went through his old sermons and edited them. And he had trouble remembering every time some of the basic quotes from our Mahzor, where the words Tefillah, Tshuva, Uzdaka came from that wholeness and charity and prayer avert the evil of the decree. But from a whole life of uprightness and upright living, what was left at the end was his uprightness. And he breathed the Torah. He wasn't quoting Torah or quoting Talmud. He had trouble doing that. But in embodying reason and moral clarity and compassion and humility and some wit about life, even his own condition and its trials, goodness. And he was good. He was no longer trying to be. He dispelled lie and falsitude just by his very presence. The following story, Hasidic story, is said about Reb Zusia of Anipol, who was one of the early masters. And it provides us with a graphic description, an illustration of these words. And it's from the viewpoint of the Torah reader in his synagogue, reflecting on years back. He says, when I heard the Reb Zusia help turn people towards God, I decided to go and see him. And when I arrived at his house of study, I was surprised to see the Rebbe wearing his talit and reciting the psalm, "Answer me when I call." Except while he said these words, he was weeping more bitterly than I'd ever seen anyone weep before. And when I glanced down at the floor, I saw that there was a man lying next to the Rebbe, moaning quietly by himself. And then suddenly the man began to scream out, "I am a sinner, I am a great sinner." And he kept repeating this over and over again, flailing his arms in all directions. When the man finally stopped screaming and moaning, I saw Reb Zusia bent down, taking the man and turning his head gently towards him, lifting him up on his feet, looking him directly in the face. Reb Zusia proclaimed, "Thine iniquity is taken away and thy sin expiated." And only later, when I had a private meeting with the Rebbe, did I find out the whole story. And this man, Reb Zusia told me, was an assistant in the house of study of the town where he lived, a different town. And he had committed a great sin, and the rabbi there did not know what penance to give him. Therefore, he told him to go see Reb Zusia and ask him what to do as a penance. So what did Zusia do? Reb Zusia said, speaking of himself, "I climbed down all the rungs until I was with him, and I bound the root of my soul to the root of his. And then he had no choice but to do penance along with me. And a very difficult and terrible penance it was. When I raised him up off the floor, his soul was pure like the day he was born." The reader continues, "When I heard these words from the Rebbe, I understood the magnitude of Rebbe Zusia's spiritual power and the depth of his love for all those who came to him. And it was then that I decided I wanted to be the Torah reader in his house of prayer." The world has much evil in it, and we each have a choice. Can we carry the goodness in our lives to be a force to counter it? And I mostly do not read the details emerging from the wars and from all the prejudiced thinking of others. I would rather read stories of heroism, put my energies there. And there are people who do this work of fighting evil directly on the ground, others through pen, others one mitzvah at a time, others through how they choose to live their lives and their day-to-day lives, upholding goodness, inspiring others through their resources. And for us Jews, this is a part of our spiritual mission, as a rabbi who both welcomed a terrorist in his congregation and then threw a chair at him. And to fight evil by bearing witness, by wrestling with our own selves, by finding the humanity when there is no humanity, by being a mensch when there is no mensch, by finding strength when all others have lost theirs, by never giving up on our fellow men, not being like Noah, who fled the evil of his fellows by going on the ark, but by arguing even with God for the lives of others, never giving up, by becoming vessels of beauty, of goodness, of life in the world, instruments for all the stories of goodwill, and by lending a hand, helping the needy. Part of the judgment we go through is also looking back at the year and how did we each do as Yisrael, as Israel, as wrestling against evil, as embodying goodness, and how can we each renew our mission to be priests who purify, who bear witness. And the shofar, what is the shofar? The shofar is a sound that drives away all evil. It emerges from the highest heaven, a note of pure righteousness that drives away all the negativity. And so, on Rosh Hashanah itself, we blow the shofar to commit ourselves anew to fight evil and renew goodness within the house of Israel, within the world, within all humanity, to shake the world with our might, and to walk the world with a smile, with resoluteness, with fearlessness, with love. Chag Sameach. Good Yom Tov.